Welcome to Washington Policy on the Go. My name is David Bose. I'm the Communications Director for Washington Policy Center. We come to you every other week outside of the legislative session with the latest in policy analysis and news about what's happening in Washington State, how it's relevant to your life, and how it's applicable perhaps to your business or to the education of your children. During the legislative session, we come to you every week with the latest on what's being proposed and how that might impact your wallet or the way you live, the way you conduct your business. So be sure to watch for that coming up in the new year during the legislative session. We'll be there every week. But in the meantime, it's every other week, and we're glad to be back with you today. If you see information in today's show that you're really interested in sharing, be sure to go to our YouTube channel. We post the videos there, and you can share that information with friends or family or other people you've met that are interested. And we encourage you to do that. We've had tremendous growth this year thanks to you being interested in the program. So keep it up and subscribe to our YouTube channel. And thank you for sharing that information. We're going to start today with Pam Lewison. She's our agriculture director. And Pam, you blogged about a federal issue, which is fairly rare for us, and we do overlap with certain federal issues. We encourage the federal government to step in and shut down the idea of the Lower Snake River dams closures, for example, and some other things. But for the most part, we're Washington Policy Center as in Washington State. However, the latest news on beef and the president's announcement on maybe encouraging importing Argentinian beef instead of to bring down the price of American beef. It's something that's stuck in your craw a bit. Why? What's wrong with that strategy? After all, doesn't that just equal supply and demand?
Sure. So, I mean, you would think that, at first blush. However, I'll step back and explain the announcement. About 10 days ago, the president announced that he thought it would be a good idea for the United States to import beef from Argentina in hopes that it would drive down the cost of beef in the grocery store, including in Washington state. Now, this seems like something that we would perhaps consider a supply and demand issue. However, what we're really talking about here is direct government intervention into what is a supply and demand uh, situation at its core. And what we're talking about is imposing the will of the federal government onto supply and demand. And what we are more specifically talking about is flooding the market with beef from somewhere else in hopes that it will depress the American market. This poses two really specific problems for American ranchers in particular. One, the agricultural market on the whole has been not great for the last 3 years throughout the United States. We have a tariff war that the president has engaged in with the rest of the world that has significantly impacted the incomes of farmers and ranchers in the United States. And then you look at beef prices, and because of the contraction of the beef market and the contraction of the beef herd in the United States, it's the smallest national beef herd we've had in over 70 years. It's the only part of the market where, because the supply has contracted so much, cattle producers are actually making money for the first time in a very, very long time. Um, However, what you are seeing in the grocery store in terms of price does not necessarily equate to a massive amount of income for ranchers. Just like we talk about all the time, what you pay at the grocery store does not necessarily translate to a rancher earning $9 a pound. It translates back to 14 cents per dollar spent at the grocery store getting back to the farm itself.
So it's another case where the sales were made ahead of time, and so the prices adjusted are based on demand in the stores. and that doesn't impact where the ranchers are getting their money.
Right. And
Right.
I think what happens is you still have a bleed out of that income in the many steps along the way with beef producers, just like you would anyone else. So while beef producers are finally making more money, they're not necessarily suddenly becoming millionaires. So when you start to bring in an influx of beef from another country, all it does is punish people who are for the first time being able to pay bills in full and on time for the first time, and not the first time ever, obviously, but certainly the first time in a long time.
Is there something currently keeping that beef out of our market? I mean, there's a, I know farmers are competing, and ranchers specifically are competing not only, U.S. beef might compete with other countries' beef, but they would also be competing with pork, chicken, other sources of protein.
Mhm.
So, what keeps Argentinian beef from being here to begin with?
So nothing. I think that's the other part of this that's interesting is um, because of the tariff situation, and I think that's something that's sort of conveniently ignored in this conversation, is that our two largest trade partners always are Canada and Mexico. Because of the tariff situation that we're having, Canada has sort of said, we're not going to trade with you based on the tariffs that you're imposing upon virtually every single thing that we try to send your way. In Mexico, we've had a stop of beef imports from Mexico because of New World screwworm, which poses an animal health risk to every single cow in the United States. Um, and I've written about it as well. Yeah, New World screwworm has closed the southern border from beef, or excuse me, to beef from Mexico coming into the country. So as a result, our two largest trade partners in terms of beef have slowed down really significantly, which means we've turned to other folks to trade beef with. The difference is what we're talking about here is a significant increase in the import of beef. Um, we as a nation could certainly grow enough beef to close to meet the demand that we have in this country for beef. We wouldn't fulfill it entirely, but we'd come pretty darn close. So what we need to be doing really is focusing on how do we meet that domestic demand first and then backfill. What the president is proposing is not that. The president is proposing um, bringing in more beef from somewhere else to drive down the cost in the grocery store.
Isn't this kind of reflective of other tariff policies that are impacting agriculture in that, you have people that are less linked to any kind of agricultural business, and they're used to city business basically, and much like the Washington State Legislature, for example, they make decisions based on their perception of farming being the same business as any other, and run the same way as any other, instead of the more traditional approach, which was the agriculture has these windows. Farmers have their seasons; they have to sell the crop in advance, so it's not gonna have the same, you know, uh, uh, supply and demand flexibility as other prices do with immediacy. So it seems like there's a lot of these tariff policies that are kind of draconian in the agriculture specter, or spheres, more so than anywhere else.
Yeah, I do think what happens more specifically in agriculture than perhaps in other areas is that we see some of those impacts more immediately um, because of the nature of how agriculture cycles. So, because we are particularly in Washington, because we are highly reliant on trade and we have so many ports and we have such a push out demand with a lot of our products, and not necessarily beef in particular, but when you look at things like our tree fruit production and many of the sort of fresh produce that we produce here in the Pacific Northwest, a lot of that product is destined for somewhere else. And when there is a duty placed upon it by another nation, it slows that process down. And ultimately, what ends up happening is the producer themselves earn less in that in aggregate in terms of gross income. And additionally, that doesn't change um, what their regulatory burden is here in Washington in particular. If you look at wages, insurance, those other sort of costs that go into that product, that hasn't changed. But what has now changed is that on this federal side of things, they have an additional cost burden that they didn't have to bear 365 days ago.
Pam, you have a question that's come in, and I should remind everyone, if you do have a question, go to the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and you can type it in there. We'll try and get all your questions answered. Try to avoid the chat box because it's a little harder for me to operate. But the question here from Martin is, how can domestic ranchers both fill current demand when the U.S. herd is at an all-time low?
So as I mentioned, I don't think we can quite meet the entirety of the need that we have with the domestic cattle herd. However, I do think it's important also to note that just as in every other form of agriculture, we are doing more with less. So, 50 years ago, it was about 50 people, I believe, that were fed by a single farmer. Now it's 176 people are being fed by that same person. So what we're really talking about here is that fat cattle, which are the cattle that are sold at market at finished weight, are larger cattle than they would have been a generation ago. So um, that is in part because we've gotten better at how we care for and feed our animals, but also part of that is about how we manage our national herd and how we um, go about calving cycles and those kinds of things. It was once upon a time that all cattle calved at a specific time of year. Now we have a respect about, some part of the national herd calves in the fall, part of it calves in the spring. So there is almost always an available finished animal to send to market so that we can ensure that, everyone has something to eat all the time.
Pam, we were talking earlier about another change in agricultural policy regarding wages and the calculation of wages for agricultural workers and some misperceptions there. Why don't you walk us through what's going on so that people are up to date on that? Because some of the criticism of the policy is that money's being taken from farm workers, and you had issue with that.
Sure. So anyone who follows agricultural labor has probably heard me talk a lot about the
Mhm.
adverse effect wage rate. Washington State is continually in the top five nationally for the hiring of H-2A temporary workers, which are workers from other countries who come here legally on a temporary work visa to work specifically in agriculture. The adverse effect wage rate is effectively their de facto minimum wage. Now, that is a wage rate that has continually escalated anywhere from 5 to 10% annually for about 10 years or so. Um, uh, and it was about, I think, 6 weeks ago, maybe a little less, that the US Department of Labor um, announced they were going to change how the adverse effect wage rate was calculated. And what they effectively did was go from one survey, uh, one agricultural worker survey to a different survey to figure out what the prevailing wage for farm workers is. In Washington, what that means is that they've gone from, excuse me, I'll take a step back. They've gone from a one wage system to a two-tiered system based on your skill level. So if you are a tier one um, sort of employee, you have a sort of base rate that's a little bit less. If you're a tier two level employee, that rate goes up, and that's based on your experience level, how long you've been doing a particularly assigned job. In Washington, what that really means is that if you're on that tier one level, you will start to be paid Washington state's minimum wage rather than this nearly $20 an hour that the current adverse effect wage rate is. If you're at tier two, that wage rate bumps up to about $19 an hour. So you're still getting paid a premium above the state's current minimum wage. But again, that is, you're commanding that premium based on your experience level, how long you've been working in agriculture, and what your assigned tasks are under your job description. So this is actually a revision that brings a little bit more um, advantage and evenness to the job market for uh, agricultural employers in particular, because there was a vast disparity in how the adverse effect wage rate was applied. So, on the West Coast, in particular, Washington, Oregon, and California, the adverse effect wage rate was extraordinarily high. Upwards of 19, almost $20 an hour for West Coast states. But if you got into the Midwest, the adverse effect wage rate was quite low. It's $10 an hour, $12 an hour. And this sort of comes more into the middle where all of those states are paying something that is similar almost in terms of what that wage rate looks like.
Well, thank you so much, Pam. Appreciate your time today, and looking forward to more from you, especially as I'm sure the tariff issue is not going to go away anytime soon from the looks of things. So looking forward to your analysis on how that pans out for our farmers and ranchers, and specifically here in Washington State, being a very trade dependent state. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Dave.
If you found this informative, share it with a friend and consider checking out one of our suggested videos over here. Make sure you're subscribed so that you can stay up to date with the latest policy news from Washington.